Okay, we've just got a couple more people joining us. I think if I probably make a start. So welcome to this talk, which is part of the Cambridge Festival. Just so you all know that you're in the right place, this is the talk, Online Harms, How AI Can Protect Us. And just so you know who I am, I'm Marcus Tomlin. I'm based in the Machine Intelligence Laboratory in the Engineering Department. And I'll be talking generally about online harms and how AI can be used to protect us, which is why the talk has this title. But some of the work that I discussed towards the end is work that I've been undertaking in collaboration with one of my current students. And my student is Howard May, and he's a fourth-year project student in the engineering department. So I'll say a little bit more about our research in just a second. Before I get going, though, just a little bit of housekeeping. It's great if you can keep your camera and microphone off during the event. If you want to ask any questions, you're very welcome to do so. And you're able to ask those either through the chat function, if you've got a question during the talk. But if you have a question at the end, you can ask that in person. You can switch your camera on and your microphone on if you want to. This talk will be recorded. It's not being recorded yet, but it will be recorded just so that we can make it available on relevant web pages after this session. Consequently, if you do switch on your camera or your microphone during the recording, you will be recorded. So if you turn on your camera or your microphone, that's in effect giving consent to be recorded. But we'll stop the recording before the Q&A session at the end, so that won't be recorded. You can ask questions in safety. After this event, you'll all be sent a short feedback questionnaire. And it's really helpful if you could fill that in. It's just useful for us to receive feedback. I think that will be sent to you via Eventbrite. So just a sort of heads up, really, to be on the lookout for that. Okay, I think the trickle of people coming in has sort of slowed a little bit. So let me share my screen and sort of get going. So, okay, that one. Okay. So hopefully you can see that okay. Right, so as I say, let's get going. The work that I'll be talking about today is related to a group of us based here at Cambridge who are involved with a project called Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the social impact of artificially intelligent communications technology. This is a sort of slide that gives you an idea of the sort of main people who are involved with this project. And as you can see, it's a mixture of people from engineering, specifically information engineering, computer science, linguistics, things like that. And we're interested really in artificial intelligence, and I'll say more about that during this talk, but it's really language-based artificial intelligence that we're interested in. I've given you a sort of brief definition of artificial intelligence there, which is from the most authoritative source possibly be found, Wikipedia. So just to give you an idea roughly of what's involved, but I'll be talking about it in more detail later, so I'm not going to go through that definition exhaustively now. And the other quotations on this slide are just there to remind you that a number of significant individuals over the last few years have emphasized the risks that are posed by AI, and that's received a lot of attention, particularly tweets, people like Elon Musk. But national governments around the world have recognized the great potential that AI has to benefit our modern societies. So there's this tension really between a considerable amount of apprehension and fear about the risks and a considerable amount of positivity about the benefits. And so that's really, it's that the current state of affairs really that motivates a talk like this. Just to give you some idea of the sorts of technologies I'm going to be talking about, you can cluster together a number of technologies and refer to them really as information and communications technology, ICT. This gives you a sort of, screen grab really of a few of these social media platforms and smartphones and things like that, things that really enable us to communicate and share information rapidly. And the quotations on this slide, which I'm not going to read aloud in detail, just give you some idea of the concerns really that people have about these technologies. There are concerns about the impact they have on mental health. There are concerns about how data is obtained and used. And there are concerns about the tensions that arise between private companies wanting to maximize their profits, the tension between that and the responsibility that they have to safeguard their users. And again, these are all issues that I'll come back to later in this talk. But this is one little cluster of technologies. And basically, the project that I mentioned earlier, the Giving Voice to Digital Democracies project, is interested in the technologies that occur at the intersection of what you might think of as artificial intelligence and these ICT technologies, these information communications technologies. Okay. And there are lots of ethical concerns about these technologies at the moment. Again, I'm not going to enumerate all of those concerns, but if you just think about smartphones just as a starting point, there seems to be a lack of consensus at the moment in response to basic questions such as, at what age should children be allowed to own a smartphone? Should their use of it be restricted? And if the answer to that is yes, who should do the restricting and how should it be implemented? And just to give you some idea as to how recently these sorts of issues have become a sort of topic of real focus, it wasn't until February 2019 that the UK's chief medical officers gave advice for the first time about children's screen time and social media use. So it's really only in the last sort of 3 years or so that there's been a real focus on these kinds of issues. And if you're particularly interested in that issue of children and artificial intelligence, the group that I mentioned earlier, the Giving Voice to Digital Democracies group, we're organising a workshop that will take place on April the 25th, and it's completely free. You can register for it through Event. And obviously, if you look at the Eventbrite page, it will give you much more information about the event. But it's really an opportunity for people to reflect upon precisely those kind of issues that I sort of mentioned on the previous slide. So I just sort of draw that to your attention in case you're interested. So the issue to do with children using smartphones and children using AI systems, that's one issue. But there are plenty of other problems that are raised by the technologies that fall into that sort of intersection that I showed you earlier. Just to be a little bit more precise, the technologies that I have in mind really are things like the various forms that are grouped together as speech technology. So things like speech recognition, speech synthesis, machine translation, dialogue systems. In case you think, oh, well, I never really use any of those sorts of systems, you're using it right now if you're reading the closed captions that are coming up, because that's just a classic example of speech recognition. So obviously I'm speaking into my microphone and it's being automatically converted into text, not always with complete success, but nonetheless it's an example of how these technologies are becoming prevalent. And related to that, there's another cluster of technologies that are often classified as natural language processing technologies. And in that group, you get things like natural language understanding, natural language generation, document summarization, and so on. And basically, virtual personal assistants like Siri and Alexa and Cortana and all the others are sort of prototypical examples of these kind of language-based AI systems. And the reason why I'm interested in those, and I've been sort of developing these systems for about 25 years now, and one of the reasons I'm interested in them is that they present particular challenges and they have particular characteristics that are not shared by other types of AI system, because not all AI systems are language-based. Right? There's forms of AI that process images. There's forms of AI that scan other forms of data. But these language-based systems present particular later in this talk, and that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in them. Now, I'm sort of assuming that many of you here are already aware of the fact that these kinds of AI systems are often seen as culprits, if you like. These systems are things that can make online environments dangerous. And this slide sort of lists some of the most prominent forms of danger that can be created, really, if these kinds of language-based AI systems are used for malicious purposes or are used in inappropriate ways. I'm not going to go through them all in detail, but things like surveillance, capitalism, so personal data being harvested and sold for profit, that's something that's often in the news and has been for quite a few years now. Online addiction is a well-attested problem. Various forms of cybercrime involve, searching through documents, looking for keywords, whether it's passwords or whatever. Twitter bots, I'll say a little bit more about Twitter bots perhaps in a second. These are automated systems that can tweet and retweet, like and follow and unfollow in order to influence public opinion about certain matters, whether it's national elections or other things. And then misinformation and disinformation. Again, when it's spread as a result of these technologies, it involves the automatic spreading of lies and inaccurate information online, again, often in order to manipulate thinking, whether it's about some kind of significant event like some war, or again, some sort of political thing. Maybe there's an approaching election, there's a desire to influence the voting patterns in certain ways. For these reasons, the ethics of these kind of systems has become a very hot topic in recent years. In the UK, the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation was established in 2018. So again, relatively recently, the European Commission published its guidelines for trustworthy AI a year later in 2019. And then as we speak, the UK government's online safety bill is sort of going through Parliament. It's being scrutinized as we speak. And so that's really the kind of state in terms of government-based legislation around these kind of issues. And one thing I want to emphasize today is that when people talk about these kinds of AI systems from an ethical perspective, they normally focus on a very small number of topics. They focus in particular on things like data protection, data privacy. That was really the driving preoccupation behind GDPR, which I'm sure most people are familiar with at the moment. There's also a strong emphasis on the need for these kinds of AI systems to be transparent or explainable or accountable. So again, that people focus on the ethics of explainability. That receives a great deal of attention, and I've summarized just some of the issues around that in the center of that slide. And then when people talk about particular scenarios where AI systems are involved, and perhaps there are complexities around ethics, they tend to be life and death scenarios. So things like AI-assisted medical diagnosis, self-driving cars. If a self-driving car hits a pedestrian and kills that person, who's responsible? Those are the kinds of ethical questions that people ask. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, the killer robots. If I get asked about anything, more often than anything else, it would probably have to be killer robots. Everyone's very, very interested in them. And I suppose my view on all of this is that all of these topics are extremely important. But in addition, I see a whole load of other ethical issues around these technologies that people far less often. As I often say to people, I've walked down many streets in recent years, but I've never once passed a killer robot, whereas I've passed many, many hundreds, probably thousands of people who are using their smartphones and are using the AI technologies underlying whichever app or system it is they're using on their smartphone. So, the killer robots are something we should be thinking about, and they may be on their way. They're not here yet. Smartphones have been around for, best part of a decade, really, and they're already having an impact on the the way we function within our societies. And of course, language is a fundamental part of the way we use those technologies, as I said earlier. So let's just say something about ethics and language. Well, these two things have quite a complex relationship. For about, 50, 60 years now, it's been recognized that speaking and writing are particular kinds of actions. Austin in 1962 explicitly classified some utterances as speech acts, things like promises and apologies and threats and curses, things like that. And just like physical actions, utterances can have good or bad consequences. And this obviously is, this really is what's led to the development of legislation around hate speech in many countries. And this is something that really since the Second World War has gradually increased. In the last, I would say, 20 to 30 years has really sort of flourished. There's been a huge increase in the legislation around hate. So in the UK Criminal Justice and Public Order Act of 1994, threatening, abusive or insulting words are explicitly prohibited. And obviously this kind of thing causes concerns around free speech and censorship. If a particular government is determining the sorts of things that can and can't be said, then it doesn't take much before that starts moving towards something that looks perhaps a bit more like censorship rather than just, safeguarding members of the society. And really, so far, the majority of discussions around these sorts of issues have focused on humans talking to other humans or humans communicating with other humans directly. But now that we have these technologies that are able to analyze language and generate language, and we have virtual personal assistants, Siri and Cortana, that we can talk to these sorts of dialogue systems, to what extent should these sorts of constraints, these sorts of linguistic constraints, be applied to these automated systems that no one was really talking about in the 70s, 80s, and not really in the 90s, to be honest. So there's often an underlying assumption that these language-based AI systems should conform to the ethical norms of the societies in which they're being used, right? So if hate speech is illegal in a particular country, then these kind of systems should not generate or distribute hate speech, right? That's often a sort of starting point for discussions around these technologies. And yet everybody recognizes that it's all considerably more complex than that, because context is really a crucial determining factor. I mean, we all know that we can use certain words and certain expressions with our close friends, and we might use those words or expressions for humorous purposes that our close friends will understand. They'll understand that it's a joke. Whereas if we use the same words, the same expressions in other contexts, formal contexts, or on a TV broadcast or something, then it would cause problems, right? So there are significant differences between different contexts, and that has an impact on language use. And again, this is a well-established fact within linguistics. So if we're thinking about hate speech in particular, because that's the topic that I'll really focus on, the sort of remaining part of this talk, then we need to say something about what it is. So I've given you a sort of broad definition there of hate speech. So it's often defined along these sort of lines. So it's a hate speech acts that can be classified as hate speech are direct and serious attacks on any protected category of people based on their race, ethnicity, national origin, religion, sex, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. And that list, these are often things that are referred to as protected characteristics. Again, within various legal codes in different countries, and a list of, they're not always identical. Some have longer lists, some have shorter lists, but they often contain those sorts of things. A recent study, a relatively recent study of online hate speech showed that about 10 to 20% of UK users have been the victims of hate speech online, and a much larger percentage, closer to 40%, have observed hate speech online, even if they haven't been victims of it. And if that hate speech is taking place on a social media platform, then there is a mechanism for the victims to make a formal complaint to the social media company. And if the social media company agrees that its terms of use have been contravened, then the offensive post may be removed. May be removed if the social media company agrees. But many of us see that as too little too late, really. If hate speech works like other forms of aggression and other forms of violence, then the harm has already been done. If someone is physically punched in the face, then okay, it's maybe, it's maybe a good thing in some ways, if retrospectively there can be some recompense, but physically the harm has already been done. And the same is true with hate speech. Once someone has already received a hateful message, psychological harm has already been done. So to do something about it retrospectively just seems like a little too late. So the question really is, given this scenario, given this significant frequency of hate speech early online, can any of these language-based AI systems be used to protect us against online hate speech? Well, this is where I sort of transition to some of the research that my student and I have been doing quite recently. I'm going to be looking at some hateful memes and describing in some detail how state-of-the-art systems can identify memes as being hateful, and then how we can use that system to protect ourselves. I've tried on the whole to use as specific examples memes that are at the less offensive end of the spectrum. Obviously, some of this material is extremely offensive. So I've tried to make sure that the examples I give are not as offensive as some of the others. But nonetheless, if this is something that you're sensitive to, then you may find some of these offensive or triggering. So just wanted to give a trigger warning so that you,
It'll be awkward if I start laughing at something like that.
You need to follow this talk.
I have to keep
have
it.
some idea as
See,
to
how I'm already
kind of
giggling.
materials that we'll be a little bit. There's only a few of these, but I just want to give you a heads up. So let's talk about what's often referred to as multimodal hate speech detection. Multimodal simply means that the detection process looks at images as well as texts. If we just looked at hateful text, that would be a monomodal detection process. And this is something that's become a major research topic in the last 3 to 4 years, really. And it's arisen in recognition of the fact that increasingly hate speech online is multimodal. It often involves text-based elements and image-based elements. Okay? Memes are a classic example of that. This is recognized as a hugely important problem by all the main sort of platforms and social platforms, things like that. Facebook. And as I say, the research I'll be talking about here has been undertaken by me and my student, Howard. So here you've got a meme that gives you some idea as to the kind of material that we're looking at. So you've got an image and you've got a text in this example. And I would say that the image by itself is pretty much innocuous. And I would say that the text by itself is pretty much innocuous, right? The image is from Encyclopedia Britannica, and it shows the Mediterranean Sea. So just, if you just focus on the image by itself, that could be in any atlas, that could be in any map of the world. There's nothing particularly controversial there. And if you take the text by itself, which asks really what's the difference between humans and animals, well, that's an age-old philosophical question. That's something that philosophers have discussed and debated, for hundreds, probably thousands of years, right? So that, in and of itself, I would say, is relatively inoffensive. Obviously, when you put the two together, this becomes an offensive meme. This is a meme that can be interpreted, I would suggest, to imply a racial slur. Okay? but it gives you an indication of how subtle these things can be, because if you just process the image in isolation, there's no problem really, and if you just process the text in isolation, no problem. So what we need to develop systems that are sophisticated enough that when they see those two elements together, they recognize that it's problematical, and that's a subtle task, no question. So we want to build a system here, or we want to build several systems really. In order to do that, we need training data. Okay, and currently for this particular task, there are two main sets of training data that are used. First one was created by Gomez et al. In 2019. So again, you can see how recent all of this research is. And it consists of 150,000 tweets that were tweeted in those dates there, so 2018 and February 2019. More recently, another data set has emerged, and that's been produced by Facebook. And this was created for the Facebook Hate Memes Challenge. And again, that was released in 2020. So it contains 10,000 plus memes. So I'm really going to be talking about the Facebook data in these little sub-bullet points. So it all consists of memes. That's surprising. It was a hateful meme challenge. In every one, the text is overlaid on the image, and you can see some examples there in the bottom right. The memes were all labeled, and by that really I just mean classified by trained human annotators. So humans decided for the training data whether a particular meme should be classified as hateful or not. So that's how the system learns the classification task. We've got a whole load of training data that's been annotated by human annotators. And to avoid the problem of the system just focusing upon the text, for instance, this data set includes what are called benign confounders. So what that really means is that you have, as you can see in the example here, like the bottom, but all these, but let's just look at the bottom two images. You have a text like, look how many people love you, and then the image of a desert, i.e. there's no one there. And then you get exactly the same text.
Literally the one that gets sent to me.
An image of lots of people, right? So if the data set includes these benign confounders, it prevents the system.
That's it, that one bush. That is the one person.
Hateful or problematical. Because
which is
it
pretty
only
awesome.
becomes hateful if it's combined with a particular image. So the system has to learn that. Now, I've been talking about these systems quite a bit. What do I actually mean by system in more detail? Well, for many AI tasks these days, the kinds of systems that we mainly develop are neural networks. Well, that's a phrase that many of you are familiar with. Neural networks are basically mathematical models that learn patterns in sequences of data. And I guess at the highest level, you can think about them as modeling the conditional probability of an input sequence, of an output sequence given a specific input sequence, right? So if we've got an output sequence, A1, A2, AM, as it is on the slide there, what we want to know is what's the probability of that output sequence given the input sequence X1, X2, Xn, as it is on the slide. Okay, so that's really what we're trying to model. And in the center of this slide, you've got a couple of depictions really of a neural network. Often you see these kind of schematic representations, circles and connecting lines. So I've given you one of those. So you've got the input layer, X1 to X4 in this case. Then you've got the output layer, A1 to A3, and you see they're all sort of interconnected. Those kind of schematic representations sort of disguise a little bit what's actually going on. So I thought I'd give you a sort of pretty simple neural network here, just to give you a flavor of the kind of maths that underlies those sort of schematic representations. So you can see hopefully in the little maths part here, we've got a vector, and that's our
vector graphs, mate.
X1 to X4. And to the left of it, you've got a matrix that's filled with weights. So these are just numbers, really, and their weights. And the weights are calculated as a result of training the system. Okay? And so all we do really is multiply the vector, our input sequence, with the weights that are in the matrix. And then we can do things like we can add bias terms, and we can do all sorts of other more complicated things. But after the equal sign in the sort of maths part there, you can see that all the input elements are being multiplied by the associated weights, and then the bias element is being added. And that's in effect what gives us the corresponding output. Okay. And so that's one of the reasons why, when people like me, when I give talks on these sorts of topics, I'll use phrases like artificial intelligence because that's very much in the public domain, and people sort of respond to that. But really, in private, when I'm working with my students and whatever, I never really talk about artificial intelligence. I basically talk about matrix algebra. These days, artificial intelligence is in essence matrix algebra. This is just a little example of matrix algebra that you can see here. And in the next few slides, I'll be using the word transformers. And transformers are basically particular kinds of neural networks. They're more complex than what I've shown you here, but they're particular kinds of neural networks that convert input sequences, output sequences. So that's what transformers are. They're just particular kinds of neural networks. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about how we process these memes. So as we've seen, the meme consists of text and it consists of image. But we can strip off the text and we can process that separately. And what we want to do with it really is to map that sequence of words to a sequence of numbers. Because in order to use our neural networks, all the inputs have to be sequences of numbers eventually. And we can do that pretty easily. We can just use a vocabulary index that number maps each of the words. So the word look might be mapped to the number 120, the word how might be mapped to the number 345, and so on. Okay, so we just have a unique word to number mapping for all the words in our lexicon. And that's how we convert a sequence of words into a sequence of numbers. That bit's quite easy. Processing the image part of the meme is a bit more difficult. But remember, when we're talking about images in the context of computers, so digital images, they're represented anyway as matrices of pixel values. So whenever you see an image online, you're basically looking at a matrix of numbers, right? So that gives us a useful starting point. And what we're able to do when we're processing the images is identify the particular objects that occur in the image. And you can see an example here, things like basketball, hat, jacket, etc. That enables us to generate object tags, as you can see again in the little image there. So in other words, from the image, we can generate a list of the objects that appear in that image. And we can also extract particular features for the regions that we're interested in. And as I say, those particular features in the image are already underlyingly sequences of numbers, so they're vectors of numbers. And this is really how the input to the neural networks or to the transformers, as I'll start calling them in a second, are converted into some sort of numerical representation, right? And that's what we need in order to train our models, and then in order to determine whether a given hateful or a given meme is hateful or not. So this just gives you an idea as to how it all sort of is put together. So on the far left, we've got our image and it's got a text. As we've seen, we can strip off the text and we can number map that. And that number mapping goes into the transformer models. And then we can process the image. We can extract certain features. We can identify certain regions. We can extract object tags for those regions, such as nose or eye, and then we can extract other features that give us some information about the image in that region. Again, that manifests itself as a vector. In this case, 2048 length vector. So The text representation and the image representation goes into our transformer model or models. And if we have more than one model, we can then combine them in complex ways. And that's called an ensembling. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second. And then at that point, we're able to make a prediction. And the prediction is really the act of classifying a given meme as being a hateful meme or not a hateful meme. I need to say something about false positives and false negatives. Now, as you can imagine, there are some examples in the data sets using here that are particularly complex. So the meme on the left here is a false positive. So in other words, this is one that's often classified as being hateful when, if you consider the text and if you consider the image, it shouldn't really be classified as hateful. It might be triggering because the subject matter is probably always going to be triggering, but it's not hateful. It's not insulting a particular group, given one of those protected characteristics that we mentioned earlier. So the text is a statement of fact about a political party, and the image, if you can't see, I know it's a bit dark, it's a woman in a museum looking at a historic Nazi flag. So it's not strictly a hateful meme, even though the subject matter is problematical. So that one is often incorrectly classified as hateful, presumably just because of the Nazi connotation. On the right, by contrast, you have an example of a false negative. So this is an image that's usually not classified as hateful, but should be. And again, just in case you can't see that too clearly, the text for this is, you've heard of Elf on a Shelf, now get ready for, and then it gives you the image. Well, Elf on a Shelf is this, it comes from this relatively recent North American tradition of putting a little elf character on a shelf and it moves about in the run-up to Christmas. But because it rhymes, it's triggered a whole load of memes where people put other rhyming words after it. You've heard of elf on a shelf, now get ready for, and then they put two words and word on, and those two words rhyme. And in order to understand why this example on the right is or should be classified as hateful, you have to have the world knowledge that the character on the left here is from the Winnie the Pooh books, and he's called Tigger, and therefore that word sounds like an extremely offensive racist slur. Okay, so it's only hateful if you're able to bring that additional information to it. Again, none of the words that appear on this meme in and of themselves are hateful, but it implies a hateful association.
Some
right?
people.
So that's very subtle, and so that sort of thing is often not classified, or classified as not hateful.
So this is the kind of stuff that AI will probably fuck up on so much.
These two notions, false positives and false negatives, will be important when I look at how these systems perform.
AI doesn't get false
in order
positives,
to determine how our systems are performing, we need to have a way of scoring them. And that's really what this slide summarizes. Don't worry if this doesn't make complete sense to you. All you really need to know is that the two metrics that we use, accuracy and AUROC, the higher the number, the better the system. Okay? So accuracy is just the percentage of correct predictions given the total number of predictions, right? So if you get 100 out of 100 correct, then you get 100%. If you get 0 out of 100 correct, then you get 0%. And if you get 50 out of 100 correct, then you get 50%. Very intuitive. AUROC, area under the ROC curve, it's a little bit more complex. I think the little graph at the bottom right is the best way to make sense of it. You've got the true positive rate going up the side here, and then the false positive rate going along the bottom. A random classifier would follow the route in the middle here. So anything above that, if the line is closer to the top left corner, then it's a better system than just a random classifier. And so the area under the curve is all of this space. So the larger that value, the better the system, if that makes sense. But as I say, it doesn't matter if you don't understand in detail how those metrics work. The higher the accuracy, the better the system. The higher the UROC score, the better the system. That's really all that matters. I've spoken a little bit about transformers already. I'm not going to talk in huge detail about the particular ones that we use for this kind of task, just because that gets complex quite quickly, and this is meant to be a tool that's accessible for a sort of non-specialist audience. One thing I would emphasize is how recently these kind of systems have been developed. So you can see it's really from 2019 onwards that these transformers that can model text as well as image have been created. As you'll see from some of the names, things like, well, Bert and Oscar and Ernieville, there's a bit of a Sesame Street theme going on here. That all started when Bert was introduced. BERT is a transformer that was introduced in 2018. It stands for bidirectional encoder representations from transformers. But that really triggered a whole sort of Bert and Ernie and Oscar, and there's a whole load of others that have Sesame Street associations. But all you really need to know about these is that they're all transformers, and they all simultaneously model text and images in slightly different ways. So they don't give exactly the same performance as each other, because the modeling process is slightly different for them. Okay? And as I'll show, we can use that to our advantage. So let's look at some numbers and see how these systems are performing. Well, in order to do this, we need a test set. And the set that we use here consists of 2,000 memes. 1,250 of them are non-hateful, and 750 of them are hateful. And we simply classify the memes in this test set using our system or our various systems, and then we measure the accuracy and the AUROC score. Okay. So the top line of this little table gives you human performance in terms of accuracy, and you can see that humans don't get 100% accuracy. And that's simply because there are sometimes disagreements about whether something should be classified as a hateful meme or not. So human beings don't agree with that always. At the extremes, they agree. In the middle, they don't always agree. So human performance is around 85%. If we use a transformer that only focuses on the text, so this is the BERT transformer that I mentioned on the other slide, then the accuracy is about 63, just under 64, and the AUROC is 62, just under 63. So that gives us a sense of how well we can do if we only look at the text. If we start to look at the text and the image together, which is what the third line of this table gives us, we can see there are performance gains, which really shows that we do need to model the image and the text together in these memes, but that shouldn't surprise us, because some of the examples we've looked at already indicate that that's so. The sort of fourth, fifth, and sixth line here, again, I'm not going to talk about these systems in detail, but these are just all different multimodal transformers, basically. And here we're just getting their performance using them in isolation. Not doing any system combination, any ensembling at this point. And you can see that they all perform pretty well. And then when we combine those three multimodal transformers via a process of ensembling, what we're trying to do really is combine their best elements so that we get an even better system. And that's what you can see in the final line of this table, because the best numbers in terms of accuracy and AUROC that we've obtained so far. And these are numbers that my student Howard May generated, and these are better than any of the numbers that have been published by any of the teams around the world working on this. So this is pretty much, state-of-the-art performance for a system of this kind, which is really nice. You can see that we're still a fair way off human performance in terms of accuracy. But considering the increase in the last couple of years, you could imagine that in the next 2 to 3 years, it should be again significant increase in performance there. So that's all fine. It's a table full of numbers. That's all very useful. But how can these kind of systems actually be of use to us in the real world? Well, this is one of the ways in which they can be used. So a few years ago, well, a couple of years ago, Stephanie Ullman, a colleague of mine, and I, we published a paper on this, really outlining ways in which these kinds of systems can be used to quarantine language on social media. And our sort of approach really was to view hate speech pretty much as a computer virus. And just as when you get a computer virus on your system, it's quarantined and you're alerted that it's there, you're invited to sort of have a look, and if you're happy that you know what that bit of software is and you want it on your system, then fine, you can allow it to be installed. But if it looks dangerous, if it looks like something that's highly suspicious, you can choose not to have it installed, right? That's how we handle computer viruses. And our suggestion really was that we should handle hate speech in exactly the same way. And so on the left, you can see a sort of screenshot of an app that another student of mine, Nicholas Fong, developed a couple of years ago. This was for a text-based hate system, but the same thing could be done easily for a multimodal system. So this is an app really that just scans social media posts as they come in on your social media feed, and it automatically determines the extent to which they might be hateful or offensive. And it gives you this warning. It gives you the option of choosing to view it. And until you say, yes, I'm happy to view that one, or no, I don't want to view it, it either gray shades or blurs the text so that you have the choice of deciding whether to read the post, or you're forced to read it, okay, before you have no choice, right? And these sorts of things can be implemented either as browser extensions or as freestanding apps. The user can specify the sensitivity code, so you can indicate, well, only give me a warning if the likelihood of it being offensive is above 30% or 50% or 70% or 80%, right? So you again have some control over that. And basically it enables users to decide whether they want to see certain posts or not, okay? And this is really how these kind of systems can protect vulnerable users. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the UK government's online safety bill is currently being scrutinised in Parliament. It's been 5 years in the making, this piece of legislation. As you'll have seen from the slides I've presented so far, 5 years ago, we didn't have state-of-the-art multimodal hateful meme detection system, right? They just didn't really exist. Technology wasn't there. So during the time that this legislation has been in the process of development, the technology that I've been describing in this talk has appeared, right? So the UK government have said that this is groundbreaking legislation that means that that users are one step closer to a safer online environment. Critics of it have said that it makes a mockery of free speech. So again, that tension that I mentioned at the start of this talk. One problem with the bill is that the definition of harm is extremely vague. I'm quoting here, harm means psychological harm amounting to at least serious distress, whatever that means. But in a sense, that shouldn't surprise us. I mean, if any of you are familiar with texts like John Stuart Mill on liberty, that profoundly influential philosophical work has been criticized for considerably more than a century now, because it never really defines harm. It uses it frequently, but it never really defines it. And so this vagueness about what harm means continues to the present day. So there's lots that I could say about the online safety bill. All I really want to emphasize at this point in the talk is that the technology is developing much, much faster than the associated legislation. And that's a problem that all governments around the world are having to contend with. And it's one of the things that causes me to think about these technologies in slightly different ways, I guess. I suppose I see these kinds of protective AI language-based systems as being a way, as providing an opportunity for us really to sort of bypass the legislation. And by that I just mean we don't have to wait for the legislation to catch up. If we want to protect ourselves online, there are existing technologies that enable us to do that. And we don't need to wait until there's some kind of legislation that's received sufficient approval to become law. And as we've seen, these kinds of systems can also alleviate concerns about free speech. So, I mean, in the kind of system that I mentioned earlier, like this, if someone has posted an offensive message, whether it's text-based, whether it's a hateful meme, I haven't stopped them posting it. All I've done is regain control as to whether I choose to read it or not. Right? So free speech receives a lot of attention. Freedom of listening receives a lot less attention. But it seems to me completely appropriate that we should be able to choose what we hear and what we don't hear, or what we see and what we don't see. And these kind of technologies can be packaged up in ways that empower people, particularly the sorts of people who are often the victims of online hate speech, to protect themselves without impeding anyone else's freedom of speech. So that's pretty much all I have to say. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, these kinds of language-based AI systems can certainly be used for harmful purposes, things like Twitter bots. They can be involved in processes associated with cybercrime and all of that. But as I've hopefully shown to some extent, they can be used for beneficial purposes. They can be used to protect users in online environments. And the automated quarantining of multimodal hate speech, so hateful memes, is potentially beneficial for several reasons. I just mentioned the most obvious ones here. It's proactive rather than reactive. So in other words, it prevents the harm being caused rather than only trying to sort of repair the damage after the harm has already been caused. That seems to me a significant benefit. And as I've already mentioned, it avoids the problem of censorship. No one is telling you what you can and can't say. The government isn't having to do that. The social media companies aren't having to do that. You can say pretty much what you like, but I don't have to listen to any of it if I don't want to. And these technologies give me the power to control what I access and what I don't, which, as I say, bypasses the censorship problem in a way that's much harder to do if you follow the legislation route. As I say, that's all I have to say. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm very happy to take any questions. I see that there's a couple that have come in while I've been talking, and if there are any others, and if people want to ask in person, then do please do that. So the question in the chat is, how do you deal with memes where there is disagreement as to whether they are hateful? So this disagreement arises obviously when humans disagree about whether they're hateful. So what normally happens is that there's more than one annotator who determines whether something is hateful or not. And consequently, you can get a confidence score derived from the human responses. And what we're really keen to see is that the computer's system output reflects that uncertainty. So if there's a meme where the humans seem to be uncertain as to whether it should be hateful or not, you'd hope that the confidence score for a meme like that would be around sort of 50% or something. In other words, not too sure about that one. Whereas the cases where all the humans are unanimous and they completely agree, you'd hope that the system has a very high confidence score. So really, we just want the system to reflect the certainty, the uncertainty of the human annotators. That's really what we're after here. But thank you, that's a good question. So is the process of detection different, and in what way, if there are hateful videos or audio? In a high level, from a sort of high perspective, the process is basically the same, but of course you introduce an additional modality if you've got audio as well. So you couldn't use the systems I've been describing specifically to identify hateful videos. For instance, here I'm just dealing with static images and text, but the basic principles would apply. You'd need some kind of neural-based system, and you'd need some kind of training data that consistent data of that kind, and then you train the system, and you'd hope that the training data was sufficiently so that when you were presented with a new example of a video that was hateful, or audio that was hateful, it would be able to classify it in that way. I mean, with audio, if it were spoken audio, then you could put it through a speech recognition system so that you get a text-based transcription of it, and then you could just use one of the text-based hate speech. That would be one way of doing it. So for some of these things, you convert them into another format and use an existing system. Thank you, though. Good question. What is the role for law enforcement in preventing, combating online hate speech? Yeah, I mean, in a sense, that's a related but slightly distinct question from the one I've been addressing, I suppose. I'm looking at it from the perspective of how can users, particularly vulnerable users, protect themselves from hate speech? Now, if people are communicating hate speech online, and if they're doing that in a country where hate speech is illegal, then they are committing a crime. And it seems to me it's entirely the job of the sort of law enforcement infrastructure to identify the people who are doing that, and to that they should be subject to the law in straightforward ways, right? Just as if in the street, I attack someone physically or stab them or punch them or something, I should be handled by the law enforcement authorities in a way that's appropriate given what I've done. So there's two things really. There's enforcing the law and making sure that people who post hate speech are punished for doing it. But then there's also the issue of protecting the victims of it. And I guess I'm more focused on the latter, but it's not disconnected from the enforcement side, of course. There's two related issues. How similar do you think that the development of this technology is to the development of spam filters? It's a similar idea, certainly. I think what I would say with the multimodal data in particular, as we've seen from some of the examples I showed, it's probably more subtle. With the spam filters, they, at least traditionally, they tend to be more text-based, although of course that's changing a little bit because increasingly the spam that we receive is multimodal. Multimodal. So they're related technologies, I would say, but thinking of hate speech in terms of a spam filter makes sense, right? If you've got an email in your inbox and it was stupid or some offensive thing, you'd hope that it would get automatically kind of stripped out and put in the junk folder, and periodically you could look at things in the junk folder and choose to remove if you wanted to. So it should work in kind of the same way. So I would say it's a related but distinct technology. So another question there, could you see this technology being adopted by law enforcement to determine whether or not a crime has been committed? Personally, I think it's a fascinating area, and one that's sort of starting to be explored in more detail. I mean, the advantage that these kind of technologies have is that they're able to process data far more rapidly than human beings can, right? So a system such as the one that I've described can process, hundreds of thousands of memes in a really short amount of time, whereas for a human being, that's an extremely laborious task. So you could well imagine a situation where some kind of law enforcement group has access to technology like this. They use it as an initial filtering stage. It flags up, let's say, hateful memes or memes that may well be hateful, and that might facilitate the process of identifying the perpetrators. But I think if it crosses over into law enforcement, obviously it would need to be the case that professionals would have the final say, making decisions about that. I think technology can be used to identify a subset of problematical posts, but then I think human beings should, go through those posts very carefully, make principled decisions about whether they feel some kind of law has been broken. So I think it can connect, but as I say, those two processes, as I see them, are distinct. How will technology hate speech removal get integrated into the world with countries having different laws and legislation? I mean, very good question, and this is one of the reasons why I tend to think about how these technologies can be used in ways that don't depend upon the sort of laws and legislation in a given country, right? So if you rely on the legislation, then you're going to have a very different experience, depending on which country you're in. If you're able to implement this as an app or as a browser extension, you can do it yourself regardless of which country you're in. If I do it as a browser extension to, say, my Chrome browser, if I go for a holiday to another country, I'm still using my Chrome browser, right? So that's why I think we need to be creative about the solutions to this problem. The legal route and the legislative route are important ones, but as I've tried to show, they're incredibly slow, which probably in some ways isn't a bad thing. You don't want laws to be made so quickly that they're useless laws, but it does mean that the technology at the moment is just outstripping legislation by several orders of magnitude. So, as I say, freestanding apps or browser extensions are a good way of bypassing that problem, really. Any other final questions? These are all really good ones. Okay, we're 3 minutes after 3 o'clock, just to end at 3. So there are no more questions. I think we're probably done for this afternoon. I hope some of that was of interest to you. And thank you for coming. And obviously there are still lots of other talks coming up in the Cambridge Festival. So, if you haven't had a sort of detailed look,
I'll be there for the next one.
There are lots of other things that might interest you as well. But yeah, I think I'll call things to a close there, and I hope that was of some interest.